You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana.
And I am Matt Gerasimovich.
And today we're covering Part 1, Chapter 61 of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. We've been talking about civilians in Stalingrad and how they're usually not the first line of consideration. Unless you see them out to be horribly executed, then you say, wait, we can save you from that execution, but we can only do that via artillery. When you only have a hammer, yada, yada. However, this chapter, we actually do go to some civilians. We go to some of the remainders in Stalingrad, some of those who did not go with the evacuation. Three primary characters to pay attention to here are Pavel Andreevich Andreev, who is a friend of the Shaposhnikovs and an old working class man, along with Stepan and Vera Spiridonov, who are the family of Seryoja. We've been speaking about in the last couple of chapters, and the family of Marusia Spiridonova, who died in Stalingrad. And they are not having a great time in the city of Stalingrad mid-war, mid-battle, as you might imagine. And is there anywhere in particular among the rubble of this of the city that you would like to begin?
Yeah, actually, because Stalingrad, if I'm remembering correctly, it ends with this somewhat optimistic view of Vera, right? So, and we talked about this in our episodes, where you have a sort of looking towards the future. She's pregnant, and this is presented, we thought, kind of optimistically when we had read this last time. Not from Life and Fate, but from the end of Stalingrad, it was presented kind of optimistically, and it's really tenuous here, I would say, how she is presented. This sort of constant nagging fear that she has in the back of her mind about her child being born sickly. She says that, well, rightfully she's thinking, what is my child going to look like when for months and months it has been essentially, suffocated by smoke and living in a cellar that's constantly being shaken by explosions, and she feels sick all the time herself. So she's like, how is this kid that I'm carrying going to feel? This quote, "What a sad, frightened baby it would be if its mother had nothing to feed her eyes on but ruins, fire, tortured earth, and a gray sky full of airplanes with black swastikas." And that is a horrifying image to think about childbirth, like within that context. And that's kind of where I wanted to start on this chapter, was just the contrasting and evolving imagery that Grossman is using to characterize Vera from Stalingrad to Life and Fate, and how that kind of, I think, reflects back his changing and evolving attitudes on life and maybe a little bit of his fate.
Yeah, that was one of the things that stuck out to me as well. I do think it's interesting. We still see this sort of cautious optimism, whereas in Stalingrad, you have this sort of, okay, we'll overcome. Here, following that section you're speaking of, she also thinks of the sort of workers who still treat her with great tenderness, asking how she is, and then thinks maybe, in that context, my child will grow up to be pure and kind-hearted. And I think that really goes with sort of the overall ethos, which is not that, like, in the end of the last book, perhaps the childbirth is sort of an innate good in its own right. It shows the continuation of the any desire to bring a child into this world. Whereas in this one, it's I'm bringing a child into the wolfhound age, as the Gerards might term it. Is it worthwhile? Will my child grow up to be a child of this age? Grow up to be not a good adult. But despite all that, there are people who still choose tenderness, still choose kindness, and she thinks maybe my child will too. Not that it is of its own right, but the human spirit may not flourish in these times, but the human spirit can definitely survive in these times. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation will grow up to be pure and kind-hearted, but that is a maybe.
Yeah, it is definitely couched in a little bit of reserve, I think. And I think that's good. I think that's what makes Life and Fate a book that's generally considered more worth reading than Stalingrad, or maybe helps explain why it's maybe a little more popular historically than Stalingrad, even though we're big softies for the old Grossman Stalingrad novel.
for the old grad.
For the for the old grad, yeah, exactly. But there's these pages that are describing how Vera is kind of just like waiting for Viktorov to come back and looking at any plane that goes by, thinking that, oh, it's Viktorov, he's come back for me, and it's never occurred to her that he may have forgotten her, which of course he hasn't, based on what we've been able to glean. Um, but I think there's in the same way that Grossman is kind of picks at people who really strongly believe in their own ideologies and the sort of endless sacrifice of individuals and peoples for the sake of some grand idea. I do kind of wonder if that's a sort of, if he's doing the same thing with Vera, if it's a touch mocking in the way that it's sort of presented, or if it's a sort of um an optimism that's sort of needed to bring you through a difficult time. And I think it's probably that latter, but I wonder what that relationship between the two is. And I think there's something there to continue going into as we progress.
Yeah, definitely something to put a pin in, keep an eye on as we go.
Yeah,
I did also want to talk about our father, Stepan Fyodorovich.
sure.
Um, Very interesting. So, Matt, you obviously know, many of our listeners may know, you read the our post today, you might also know certain cities after the World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, however you want to call it, in the Soviet Union were designated hero cities because of their contributions to the war effort. Of course, Stalingrad, later Volgograd, or later and before Volgograd, is designated one of these hero cities. And we've talked about a lot about how Grossman, I like this term that you use, Matt, memorializes but does not valorize. Um, you a long time ago called an example, I think, from the Gerard's biography, where even some of the lines that he wrote are on a major monument. I think maybe even the one in Moscow, but they're not attributed to him. And I was reading that section the other day, and another element that previously escaped my attention is also there, which is not only is it Grossman's work, which is not attributed to him, that those lines that were taken are also about a specific unit, which was almost certainly a penal unit, or not a penal unit, almost certainly was entirely wiped out. And none of those details make it through, according to the Gerards. And
Right.
so the actual people tend to get replaced by this idea of heroism, the hero city, the hero workers, all these people who did so much. But here we look at the actual heroes, and they're not heroes. They're people. They are not heroically going about their day, throwing up their arms, thinking about how great their labor is. It sucks. Many of their family are gone, maybe dead. Maybe their work is under constant bombardment. They may be targeted. They may be killed for the work they're doing. It's terrifying. Many of them want to flee. Stepan wants to flee. Everyone else in his office wants to run away and live somewhere, and they really can't, not because they're too heroic to, but just because they're too tired to think of even running. These are not heroes, but that doesn't mean that it's not incredibly brave what they're doing. It's not heroic in character what they're doing, but they're also people. They're not, probably if they had another chance they'd take it, but they don't, so they keep on doing their jobs. And I think that is a far more heroic thing than to just say, someone is a hero, right? I mean, in this case, we've got Stepan being called a hero and feeling embarrassed because I'm not. I'm just a guy. I'm just doing my work. And I think that, again, that dimension that Grossman so consistently brings in, same idea being brought here to the idea of the heroes and bringing them back down to earth in the best way possible, because they're people too, and and being heroic, I think, is in no way contradictory to being cowardly or feeling cowardly or wanting to run. I think in that simple way of looking at things, those things can't coexist, when the reality is they certainly can. You can have someone like Stepan, like his workers, who are so essential to what they do, and you can also have them wanting to run away every day of their life from what they do. Nothing contradictory about that, and nothing, in no way would one invalidate the bravery of the other, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think any of us would be lying to ourselves if we were thinking about ourselves in that situation and thinking, "Oh, I would totally have no qualms or reservations about doing that. I would wholeheartedly sacrifice myself for X, Y, or Z. I would really question whether that is true, and if so, who you then should probably talk to.
Yeah, yeah. I also wanted to go to something from a reader who just wanted to highlight a certain quote. This is at the very beginning. We have of course, our friend Pavel Andreevich, whose wife has just died. She dies at the end of Stalingrad, if my memory serves me. Now he's just found out about it. They have been, I believe, they were evacuated or they were not in the city at the time of the invasion. But Leia brings in this quote and says that they really liked it or they loved it. His whole life had been reflected in that of his wife. Everything good or bad that had happened to him, all his feelings of joy and sadness, had importance only insofar as he was able to see them reflected in her soul. And if you've read Stalingrad, you know the kind of troubled relationship that Pavel had with his wife Varya. And that's just something I really love about Grossman's writing is the way he writes these troubled relationships. There's a writer, and this is my white whale of a quote I'm trying to find. But basically the quote says something along the lines of every relationship has his secret sins to bear. This may even very well be a Grossman quote that I've lost track of. And I think Grossman does that very well, writing those troubled relationships, codependent maybe even, but these lives that are built on that are not perfect, very tough in many ways, and yet are so full of each other in ways that you can't even detach yourself from. And Victor and Ludmilla and Pavel and Varvarya and our friend the peasant whose name Vavilov and his wife whose name I've forgotten. So many of these characters just have such an excellent dynamic. I think it's so hard to get at in writing sometimes. I would like to wholeheartedly endorse what Leia has to say here.
Yeah, I think it gets to something too about how Grossman is writing these characters, which is that they're not really always described as having, almost never described as having certain objective qualities, because that kind of goes against how he views people, but rather they're defined in relationship to other people. And so that it actually does say something kind of profound about how we live and exist within our relationships with others. And so that's another thing that I think is really good with this book and really why it continues to stand the test of time. And again, when we're talking about the actual tragedies of the 20th century, why that sort of, the amount of death that took place during the 20th century, why that continues to be, so profound, is exactly because of this relationship that Grossman sees between people essentially being eradicated. And so I think that is a good quote to pick up. All right, but we have to stop. We're gonna be like a whole episode here.
Yeah. If you give a mouse a cookie.
If you give us a Grossman quote.
Let's get that on a t-shirt. But anyway, yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it.
If you give a podcaster a Grossman quote, he will make you read 700 chapters.
Oh, yeah, don't get it. Well, you say that as a joke, but I'm trying to tally up all the chapters between Life and Fate, Stalingrad, and I'm going to count War and Peace for this one, how much we've referenced it. I think
who even knows?
We might be closer to 700 than we'd feel comfortable with.
Yeah, honestly.
Anywho,
I feel like that's where we have to leave it, unless you have anything else.
I'm good.
All right. In that case, you will hear from us again soon.